Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming to this special invited Dean's Lecture. And, you know, I feel like I don't really need to introduce Ellen Silbergeld, but it's part of my job, so I have to do it. And, you know, I think probably everybody in the room knows Ellen, and she was one of the first faculty members I met when I became dean. And what was amazing was her incredibly innovative way of identifying problems and then doing research to quantitate them. And it was research that at one end was cutting edge for sure, but also that everybody could understand. I remember, I don't know exactly what she's going to talk about. I mean, I know she's going to talk about her book, but when she you know, went down the road, the highway on the Eastern Shore with the car windows open, and then cultured soda cans that were in the cup holders in her car for resistant, you know, MRSA from the chicken. I should say the big thing, she was following a chicken truck down the road and showing that you could identify and culture these methicillin resistant and other resistant organisms that were coming from the airstream of the chicken truck. So, I mean, she's just an incredibly innovative thinker, and that's one of the reasons that she won a MacArthur Genius Award. But so I think you may not know that her PhD comes from doggy. She has a PhD from Johns Hopkins in environmental engineering, and so it's especially fitting that in this year where we're celebrating the union of the old doggy and the old EHS with her new Department of Environmental Health and Engineering. And she was appointed professor here in the early 1990s, and she has joint appointments in epidemiology and health policy management. And as I alluded to, her research does bridge sort of laboratory-based investigation with public policy. And she has an uncanny ability to sort of relate what happens in the laboratory to the food system, how we eat, how we raise our food. She's incorporated toxicology and mechanistic toxicology with epidemiology to look at both mechanisms and then the broad public health impact of her work. So she looks at the health and environmental impacts of industrial food production, cardiovascular risk of arsenic, lead, and cadmium, and immunotoxicity of mercury compounds. In fact, we first met, I remember, because I was working on kidney disease and you were working on lead, and there's obviously a link there. So she's done much of what she's going to talk about today, I think, is her work on food animal production. And she was really one of the first people in the U.S. to take an epidemiologic approach to U.S. farmers and workers in slaughterhouses, looking at the occupational risk associated with it, and showing that antimicrobial drugs in drug feeds, animal feeds, is a significant driver for the emergence of drug resistance. And as a physician, you know, when I practiced medicine, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out ways where we would use our antibiotics wisely so we wouldn't induce antimicrobial resistance. And then I came to the school and found out that the overwhelming majority of antibiotics are not used for humans, but in the food we eat. She's been supported by the NIH, by every leading foundation and funder. She's been a science advisor to the EPA and other federal organizations. She's been editor of leading environmental health journals and on the editorial boards of many high-impact journals. She has over 450 peer-reviewed articles, monographs, and reviews. And she, as I mentioned, has been awarded a MacArthur Genius Award. She's received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Toxicology and the Barsky Award from the APHA. So she's going to talk, I think, about chickenizing farms and foods, and she also makes up new words. That's another thing that she does. And I know it's going to be an exciting and interesting talk. So please join me in welcoming Ellen Silbergeld.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. When I first started doing this, I never thought I'd be up here with a picture of a book that I wrote. So that's pretty amazing. And I have to say the title of my talk is An Act of Sedition Against the Johns Hopkins Press, because this is the title I wanted to use for my book, Aiming at the Heart. But one of their editors said, oh, well, people are going to think this is some kind of romance novel. And I said, well, then they'll buy it. But they didn't buy it. So it is aiming for the heart. And it really is, I hope, following on the example of Upton Sinclair, because I think it's time we kind of recharged that whole way of thinking about this problem. And in many ways, therefore, it's different from most books that have recently been written about food and food production in this country. In fact, the first sentence of my book is, this book is not about food. There are no recipes, no recommendations about what you should eat or cook, but it's really how food gets to our tables and how it has changed over a remarkably short period of time. So Upton Sinclair was not satisfied when his book was published, and even though almost immediately the Theodore Roosevelt administration passed legislation that updated new food and drug safety legislation, but he wrote the book about worker safety. And so after it was published, he said, I aimed for the heart, but somehow hit the stomach. So I'm trying to bring the stomach back into this story. I want to thank a lot of people. Writing a book, as Mike said, is somewhat like giving a baby with barbed wire, but I said it's also like giving a baby but having a whole bunch of critics in the room talking about how you're doing in delivering this baby. So certainly to Hopkins for sabbatical funding, Rockefeller Foundation for a month at Bellagio. Great pleasure of being at our sister institution, the School of Advanced International Studies in, whoops, what was that? I think I did something bad. In Bellagio, and where I had the pleasure of working with Mike Plummer, now the dean there, who explained agricultural subsidies to me. Many other people, Richard Kagan and Al Summer, were actually believing that I would do this at a point when I was afraid to mention it. And then finally to the slow food movement in Italy, who was one of the first groups to invite me to talk and gave some very stringent and useful criticism. That's Bellagio. You can see how wonderful it is. And it made up for the fact that that first month, mostly I just stared at a white computer screen. I had no idea how to start, how one starts writing a book. But I do know that really you write a book, I think, best if you somehow feel impelled to do it. And I had come to a point in studying this topic where I really felt there were things I needed to understand and perhaps things that would be useful for others to understand. And there are certainly many ways or reasons why people write books. I think it was Samuel Johnson who said, anybody who writes without trying to earn money is an idiot, but that's why we're here, right? And so you can write to support a hypothesis or an advocacy position that you've developed of your experience in working on an issue. And that's certainly how Upton Sinclair worked and thought in devising and writing his novel, The Jungle. You can try to warn about perhaps things that haven't been realized or to discover kind of contingent relationships between, for example, the past and the present, which I found myself doing a lot in this book. And I did get an undergraduate degree in history before I became an engineer and before I came to public health. So that could be a historical approach to an issue. And finally, I think for all of us, to identify opportunities for interventions. So these are really the motivations. Then I realized I had to decide, where am I going to start? And I thought it would be useful to try and discern what were my basic thoughts about agriculture and food. What did I really think about the problem? And I realized very soon, and this is something that I didn't realize how much of an influence it was going to have on how I wrote this book, but I realized that I actually believe that people have a right to safe and affordable food. And as I went through this book, that actually closed off certain potential avenues for interventions. And this is something that I did not expect to happen. And I also believe that, there's an ethical obligation to identify pathways that can feed the world. And to some extent, that also means feeding the world what it wants to eat. Now, I know that's a tough thing because the world sometimes wants to eat things that maybe they shouldn't eat. But trying to change people's behaviors and desires is something that some of us spend a lot of time thinking about. In the meantime, people need to eat. So those became much more influential on where this book went. Why did I get involved in it? Well, this picture, as they say, says it all. This is the Pfiesteria episode that some of you may remember in Maryland and Virginia. So here's the Pocomoke River, in which I've spent more time than I ever thought in my life. And it was one of the rivers where this peculiar kind of characteristic incidents associated with massive fish death occurred. And we still don't really know what happened, but it is thought to have been associated with a certain dinoflagellate called Pfiesteria biscuita, fish-killing Pfiesteria, that created these kinds of very striking lesions. Well, what it did to me was alert me to the notion that a driving force for the outbreak of Pfiesteria was, in fact, chicken waste, one of my favorite topics in life now for the last 12 years. And these dark areas you can see here are where fresh waste has been disposed. And these long, low white buildings, which I never noticed in all my years of going over to Ocean City and other excursions to the Eastern Shore, these are chicken houses. And what you can see is that waste disposal, these activities are right alongside this river. So it's this connection between the chicken industry and an ecological, environmental event that kind of tied me into this as soon as I became aware of it. And I became aware of it, I think, very fortuitously. In fact, this whole book depends upon a number of fortuitous contingent events. First off is being in the state of Maryland. Little known, maybe to many of you in this room, we are the fourth largest producer of broiler chickens in the United States. The state of Maryland grows between 300 and 400 million broiler chickens a year. We're a very small state. They're all grown over here in a very small part of the Eastern Shore. Moreover, this is where it all started. I had no idea about any of this as I began. And so this was really a very fertile area to start writing this book, particularly from the historical point of view, because it's all here and it's all ready to be found out, although very few people have attempted to discern the story of chickenization. By the way, that word was invented by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Not by me. It's a fantastic word.
Did they copyright it?
I don't know, but somebody should. Maybe we should. We could have a department of chickenization. How about that? And I could be the chair. Okay. The other great inspiration was working with labor unions through my wonderful colleague, Carol Resnick, and many others, over on the Eastern Shore, which was why this is the other aspect of being in Maryland. Maryland is a state that has very strong support for the rights of labor. So unlike many other agricultural states in this country, which are so-called right-to-work states, right to work means the right to work and not have union representation, in case you didn't know. But Maryland has strong support for labor rights, and in fact, the chicken workers were able to sue Purdue over their status as contract labor. And that was another very important aspect of it being in Maryland. And the third was really, while I started at the University of Maryland working on this problem, and University of Maryland is a land-grant school, so it has a College of Agriculture, and I actually went out with people from the Purdue School of Poultry Science until they discovered that maybe I was not their friend, but I gained a lot of first-hand experience. Then, very fortuitously, when it was clear I better get out of there, I came over to Hopkins and was able to come back to an institution that was also fortuitous in this whole story, which I'll show you. So this is Keith Ludlam, and he was one of my inspirations because at one point when we were down at the Union Hall serving the largest pork slaughterhouse in the world in Tar Heel, North Carolina, I brought down a copy of The Jungle and I left it on his desk. And about half an hour later or so, he came out of his office and he had the book in his hand. He's a big guy. He used to work on the hog killing floor. You don't mess with people like that. These are like linebackers in pro football. And he said, "When the hell was this book written?" And I said, 1905. And he said, "Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed at all. You must write a book." So that was one inspiration. And the other was my realization, this map, and I talk about it in the book and how important this map was to me. Because somehow I had no idea that this had become the dominant global model. I thought maybe there was time to talk about this and maybe steer people towards better practices, etc. No. This is chickenization, that word again, of both hog production and poultry density as outlined by the Food and Agriculture Organization back in 2006. So this is a done deal. And so we are dealing with a problem that we now must catch up with, rather than the opportunity to insert alternative ways for the production of meat-based protein around the world. And you just have to accept that. So why did chickenization start here? There's a mythological story spread by the state of Delaware, but we don't need to pay too much attention to Delaware, right? And then there's the true story, which involves Maryland. And the untrue story is the legend of Cecile Steel over here. Apparently one day, this is before we had broiler chickens. We had, the word broiler, by the way, was also coined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, great source of importantly useful words, because this was a chicken you could cook very easily. Before that, you had to boil chickens, and they were usually retired layers, so they were pretty tough. So at the very beginning of the broiler, time of the broilers, Cecile was still working with egg layers, and she ordered her 50 chickens for the year, and somehow was delivered 500 instead. Now, according to the state of Delaware, that means she was the initiator of industrial chicken production. She was no such thing. She just put her 500 chickens in a slightly larger yard than she had been accustomed to using for 50, and I'll show you why this is really important. This is the innovator over here, Arthur Purdue, who's the man who founded the Purdue Company. And he's a person deserving of some respect and interest because he was an extraordinary innovator. And I think, I've adopted this terminology that people have drawn from the technology industry, that sometimes real innovation comes from someone who isn't part of the industry, but stands outside it and is able to perceive and perhaps offer the notion of something very, very different from standard production. And that is what he was able to do. He was actually a railroad clerk in Princess Anne, Maryland. And I think this might be important because John Tyson, who a little bit later, I'm not going to cede any primacy to Arkansas, don't worry, this is a Maryland thing. He ran long-distance trucking. So both of them were really into understanding transportation networks and how the U.S. highway system, which was being built in the 1920s, how the improvements in automotive engines, which was being done through the addition of lead, a great idea, and the invention of refrigeration. Some of you may know that the person who invented tetraethyl lead was also the person who invented CFCs. Fantastic figure in environmental health. But all those things kind of came together, and I think that really favored somebody who came from outside, but knew about some innovative things that were happening that might be applicable to revving up poultry production. So that may be one reason. Now the others is sort of socioeconomic. In the late 1920s, King Cotton collapsed around the South. So there was a tremendous amount of surplus labor in the southeastern United States that had been deployed since, well, in slavery times and afterwards during Reconstruction as the main way of absorbing unskilled rural labor. Now it was unemployed. In addition, the southern states of the United States have a tradition of a particular type of agriculture which is known as sharecropping, which bears a great resemblance to how the chicken industry manages its inputs and outputs. Now in sharecropping, the farmer may own the land, the farmer may own his house, but the farmer receives seeds from the producer and he grows the cotton, and then at the end of the period of cotton growth, that cotton is picked and the farmer is paid on the amount and quality of the cotton that is produced. That's the same model as the chicken contract. And again, these are regions that are in many ways disempowered politically and communities as well. So, in fact, there may be a reason why it began in the southeastern United States, because otherwise there's no reason whatsoever. Why would you try to dominate the American food table from the eastern shore of Maryland? Why would you not do this in an area where, for example, there's more abundant support of crops that can provide feeds, or that are closer to major cities, as with the meat packing plants in the Midwest? This is a very strange process if you think about it, you know, without the historical embedment of what I think may be important factors. And of course, all of this makes it difficult to change the way we grow chickens. So what is chickenization, this wonderful word? I believe it was invented by Steve Martinez, who's an economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I was surfing their web at their library and came across a paper called The Chickenization of Pork Production. First, I thought this might be some really bizarre manifestation of biotechnology in which we're using chickens to produce pork. But no, when I got him on the phone, he said, no. This is a word that really, after all, is an homage to your state and Arthur Purdue. And the definition, the technical definition, is application of an industrial model of production and management to any aspect of agriculture. So anything, it's a spreading of a model that started with 2 species of food animals, chickens and pork, but now encompasses many other species, fish, as well as the crops that support this kind of intensive production. So this is just to say that this is where it all started. And as my friend Steve Wing at the University of North Carolina says, that the broiler belt has a coincident location with the Bible Belt, which again he ascribes to the socioeconomics of the populations that are really in this area. But it's again to emphasize that this is kind of an odd area to build intensive food animal production, if you think about markets as they were at the time. But of course, both John Tyson in Arkansas and Purdue knew that very soon you were not going to be limited by this kind of geography of markets because of the advent of mass transportation. And it took off like lightning. These are data that come from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So you start in 1920, really before there were broilers. It took quite a while to get this information, I can tell you. 1923 is when the U.S. Department of Agriculture introduced this new chicken breed, which was descended from the Rhode Island Red crossed with a Leghorn. And it was called the broiler because it would grow relatively quickly and you could cook it by broiling rather than boiling. And you can see that in 1925, about the time that Mrs. Steel got her excess animals, that there was maybe 50,000. This is national production. But look at 1934, where over 1 million chickens being produced. And you can see it just continues and continues. So that in fact, overall now, we grow almost 9 billion broilers a year. This is an extraordinary fast transformation of an industry that goes back to the Neolithic, if you will, when people began to pen birds that could lay eggs that they could eat. Now, the first thing that interested me was, why did this contract model, which I'll describe, why was this applied to chickens? And I've given you a little hint about perhaps some of the historical precursors of the contract model and its coincident location in the southeastern United States. But this is what it really is. It's to some extent an application of the Fordist model of production, which, remember, takes off in the 1920s as well. Although my good friend Erica Schoenberger has pointed out the differences between the poultry industry and Fordism per se. But it is highly efficient and places a great value on efficiency of production, and used, as in early automobile production, a production line structure which persists to this day. And also, in terms of management and economics, it is a system in which cost centers are kind of kept out of the economic model. So to the extent possible, you either subcontract away the things that are going to be difficult or expensive, or you just kind of ignore them. And you get society to accept the fact that you're not going to deal with them. I think the real genius of Arthur Purdue was to realize what the center of intensive chicken production was. And I've always asked people, what do you think the center would be? And some people say, oh, you want to own all the chickens. No, let me tell you, I have farmers in my family. You don't want to be involved in primary production and agriculture. Nobody makes a lot of money that way. So clearly not. Then they say, well, maybe you want to sell retail chickens. No. What Arthur Purdue figured out, and this is why he really is a genius, was that the key part of this process to control, if you really want to make a lot of money, in chickens is slaughter and processing. Now, why is that? Because all the farmers have to bring their animals to you, the raw inputs to you, and you set the price you're going to pay. Then all the wholesalers come to you to get the dressed consumer product, and you set the cost of that as well. So it's the economic sweet spot in this entire arrangement. And really, Ford figured that out as well. Ford did not own steel plants. He didn't own retail car dealerships. He took the steel, made the cars, and then sold it through contractors who contracted with Ford Motor Company to sell Ford cars. And once you make this the central node of your activities, then it's really important for efficiency that you can control the flow of inputs, that would be live chickens, in terms of quality and quantity. So this wouldn't work if 1 week 1 million chickens showed up at the Purdue slaughterhouses, and the next week 10,000. No, he needs an even flow in so he can guarantee an even flow out. And that's really the structural justification for contracting, so he can schedule the arrival of live chickens into the slaughterhouse. But of course, there are both pros and cons of the model. There is an assurance to farmers that their product will be bought. The contract guarantees that the contractor will actually buy the live product at the end of its growing time. That's not always true in agriculture, and that's why agriculture has historically been a precarious profession and enterprise to be involved in. However, it did end farmer autonomy. So now, in fact, people who raise chickens are not even referred to as farmers. They're called growers, because they're performing that part of the food chain, which is taking young chicks and raising them to market weight. They're growers, not farmers. And it's very interesting because there was early in the days of the ramping up of the chicken industry, which, as you can see, was very rapid, going from 50,000 to 7 million, the US government actually intervened and filed suits against notably Tyson and Purdue for semi-monopolistic practices. Now, some of you may be lawyers. I think there's one right there. But apparently how the companies got out, and correct me if I'm wrong, Counselor, was that they're not actually monopolies, because there are at least 3 integrators, and therefore the court said that means there isn't a monopoly. I think we're having the same argument now over the AT&T and Time Warner reorganization, right? So monopoly can be interpreted literally as mono. One enterprise controls the market. So if there are 3 enterprises that control the market, monopoly law does not apply. So several lawsuits brought by the USDA, I want to stress, went all the way to the Supreme Court and were struck down. So it's not clear that this will change. Now, the second question I was really interested in was, how did antimicrobial drugs get into food animal production? You know, if you think about it, it's not immediately obvious that antibiotics would be somehow beneficial to poultry production. You know, they were first isolated and tested by Fleming, and then further worked upon and purified, and then submitted to mass production through a variety of steps, Flory and others involved. And what really startled me was that the application of these new compounds that were really recognized as wonder drugs started to be applied to the production of poultry almost as soon as they went on the market for clinical medicine. There really wasn't much of a gap. So what was going on here? And who decided to do this? Well, I was told by somebody who actually wrote an article in the Scientific American, which is, I'm happy to say, I guess like Donald Trump, completely wrong, is that, well, maybe there was kind of these residues left over from the fermentation plants in New Jersey where they were growing antibiotics from bacteria, and that they gave that mash to the poultry farmers to use as feed. There's absolutely no support for that at all, that there was any communication whatsoever. And in fact, the story goes back earlier. It goes back to this remarkable woman, Lucy Wells, who was the first woman in England to receive a medical degree from other than a women's medical school and to be licensed to practice medicine, although she then found she couldn't actually get a job in England. So she went off to India, where she worked for the Tata companies who were having problem with pernicious anemia among their workers. So this got her very interested in things that could correct or deal with pernicious anemia, and she studied that very, very thoroughly. And that then merged with this notion of the animal protein factor. And it was being observed in the early days of the intensive confined chicken industry that some of the chickens were not doing so well. And they didn't do well if they were on a totally vegetarian diet. That they needed some unknown factor called the animal protein factor. Now, she actually identified what that was, and we now know that's vitamin B12. But nobody knew at that time. And we then move forward. This is all going on in the 1920s, long before antibiotics were discovered, and long before anybody had an idea of putting them into animal feeds. But when the poultry industry begins, a group of scientists at Letterly got interested in this whole issue of the animal protein factor. And in fact, streptomyces makes vitamin B12. It wasn't identified at the time. And the irony is, if they had waited 2 years when vitamin B12 was isolated, we could have skipped, I think, this whole horror that we got into through the addition of antibiotics to animal feeds. But it's a fascinating story and totally different from anything I'd been told. And again, just like the story of how fast the poultry industry began to rise as soon as it began, this is how fast drugs started being put into feeds for so-called growth promotion uses. I mean, it's an astounding story. So you see penicillin going in 1946, and a vast flurry of activity up through the early 1950s, and then something of a slowdown, but continued additions. This is just poultry. We have other problems with third and fourth generation cephalosporins going on in dairy and other animal production sites. But it's an amazing adoption of this idea. And I've actually looked through most of the registrations that were filed with the FDA. Now, I know back in 1946, maybe there was not a high degree of evidence-based decision-making going on there. There may still not be a high degree at FDA Center of Veterinary Medicine, if you want my personal opinion, and you may quote me. But you would have studies that, for example, on oxytetracycline, where 8 chickens were held in a lab for 2 weeks, and growth was measured. So it's a very weak body of evidence at best, but just this enormous immediate investment in this attitude. Now, the other thing I did hear about from someone was, well, there was a crisis in the supply of corn. So something had to be done to make chickens convert corn in the feed more rapidly into chicken flesh. Well, I went back and looked at all the agricultural data. There's absolutely no crisis in the production of corn over this period of time. Corn market was remarkably stable. There were no fluctuations in cost, no scarcities. So I think it may be really the story of the animal protein factor. So then we wind up then with what we've got, an integrated mode of production, both economic, organization, and methods, characterized by small numbers of producers and farmers, high density of animals, so-called confined operations, so-called, controlled environments, contractual arrangements, and externalized costs. That about sums up both the good and the bad aspects of this model. The integrated model is one that is dependent on what's called vertical integration. So you can have several types of integration. You can control an industry in a horizontal way. You control all similar levels of manufacture or raw materials. Or you can go from the top, say producing chicks, producing feeds, all the way down to retail sales. And that's vertical integration. And again, it really functions best because it allows industries to identify so-called cost centers and keep them out of their economic model. And it does depend, as I said, upon contractual arrangements. So it looks like this. This is a drawing of vertical integration for turkeys. And again, look at this. Look how fast it happens. Everything in this industry happens so fast. So in 1950, there was somewhere around 5% of the broilers in the United States were produced under contract and in some cases under vertical integration. Look at 1955. You're up at about 90% being produced by contract and vertical integration. It's absolutely transformational what happened once this model was adopted. So what are some of these externalized costs? Well, I think some of us know this, and some of us in this room have worked on this. And that is certainly the issue of managing the wastes, which impact on air, water, and soils. Growers are also responsible for improving their buildings and operations whenever the integrator decides that something needs to be changed, such as the ventilation system or the lighting system or the number of animals that are going to be housed. I don't know how many of you know now that we have what's called super houses over in the Eastern Shore, which are housing 250,000 birds in one building. So, but the grower has to make that investment to build that new building. There are other kinds of environmental impacts, there are socioeconomic impacts, and there are episodic and epidemic disease impacts from this model. So a lot of the environmental impacts arise from some of the interesting locational decisions that have been made in this industry, not just in the United States, because over here we have the Pearl River, which is completely beset by aquaculture in the delta of the Pearl River. But this is North Carolina, and I was just down there and I could revisit the whole story of Hurricane Floyd, which ravaged through the Tidewater region, resulting in the complete swamping of all the waste systems and many of the pig farms, then joining into the rivers and into the Pamlico Sound right here. And it happened once more. So that sometimes the obvious interactions between agriculture and environment are exacerbated by the places we decide to locate them in. And that's certainly been true here. Now, here's a really dramatic picture that embeds some of the socioeconomic changes that have come about. So from the period of 1975 to the present, the number of broilers, for example, that are being produced has grown enormously, and the number of farms has decreased tremendously. Same picture, even more dramatic for hog production. This has major impacts on rural communities, to lose a whole sector of production, employment, family life, so over such a very short period of time. And it is a problem for food safety. When I began this book, I was under some impression, well, maybe, intensive agriculture would do a better job on food safety because you have large producers and they'd be able to invest in methodologies that would reduce food contamination. But I have to say, I've decided that's completely wrong. As you may know, foodborne illness in this country is associated with between 8 and 10 million cases of disease, and most of the causes are not known and are untraceable for reasons that we can discuss. The unique gift of the modern model, through the use of the antimicrobials in feeds, is the prevalence of antimicrobial resistant pathogens, as opposed to the normal load of bacteria that comes through eating another animal. And some of these are old and new: Campylobacter, C. difficile, and the most recent one is polymyxins, which was first identified in Chinese agriculture and is considered to be the drug of last resort for the various pathogens such as Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, that were treated with various beta-lactams. So as the chief medical officer for the United Kingdom said, we are looking at the end of the antibiotic era. It is in front of our faces. And of course, antimicrobial resistant infections are prevalent in U.S. consumer meat products, that is, carriage by the animals, as Megan knows as well. I just came back from a meeting about this on, extended spectrum beta-lactamase pathogens and Bacteriaceae, and 50% of poultry products in the EU carry this very difficult to treat strain of common infections for UTIs, skin infections, and bacteremias. And 30 to 50% of meat and poultry products were tested by Lance Price, who was a student here, and found to carry multi-drug resistant Staph aureus. So this is endemic to the food supply. So I conclude by saying that I went through a long analysis of this, and I talked with a lot of people who've been very committed to alternative ways of agriculture. I waded through more statistics than I ever thought I would ever do. I'm sorry, statisticians. That the industrial model, that is the efficiency and flexibility and reliability of the industrial model, is needed to provide food for urbanized populations, rich and poor. I mean, you know that most of the world will live in cities by 2030, and it will only increase. And much as I enjoy going to farmers markets as much as anyone, farmers markets cannot feed cities. Local levels of production cannot feed cities. So if you're thinking about where are most of the starving people in the world, they're in cities. And I go back to sort of my original stake in this of we must have safe and affordable food. Now, we don't have safe food. It certainly is affordable. So what do we do about its externalities? But I don't think the solution is to go back to a very inefficient style of agriculture, and one that's extremely expensive. The current, but the problem is really not so much inherent to the current model, it's because it's almost completely unregulated. You know, the analogy I like to present is the analogy of the car. When the car was first introduced, about the same time as the broiler, it was a relatively inefficient creature, and then tetraethyl lead was discovered, and it became much more efficient. Probably a bad decision to add it to cars, but made the cars run better and everybody was happy. Well, about 1970, we decided that maybe cars with their inefficient engines were contributing to really dangerous urban smog levels in Los Angeles and other cities. That was not so good either. It was also noted that a lot of people died in car crashes because the cars were not safe. Now, we didn't go back to riding in horses and buggies. I'm sorry, this is my analogy here for the people who argue about going back to local production. What we did was take the lead out of gasoline, require the catalytic converter to increase the efficiency of burning gasoline and the reduction in polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and ozone, and we required seatbelts and airbags in cars to reduce the lethality of interactions between cars. That's where we really are with this industry. We haven't done much to make it behave. And I came away thinking that most of the problems, I'm not saying all of them, but most of the problems of current industrial food animal production are not inherent in its scale or structure, but really in the total lack of a decision made not to regulate any aspect of its behavior. So what I end with in the book is that we really need to accept that agriculture is industrial. And that's why I wrote the first chapter to the book, which when I realized that there was a problem in talking about that. There are some historians of agriculture who still insist that agriculture cannot be industrialized. There was one historian from Purdue, not Purdue the company, but Purdue the university, and who said that agriculture can never be industrialized. And Alan, you were in Indiana. How could you live in Indiana and not notice that agriculture has been industrialized? It seems astounding to me. So we have to take it for what it is now, and then that will give us the opportunity to end agriculture's current privileged status. This is really important because agriculture, big agriculture, loves to say it's not industrialized. If you go to the websites of Purdue or Tyson or Smithfield, it shows beautiful bucolic farms with happy animals gambling over green grass. I'm here to tell you those animals never get out to gamble in green grass. But you know, that makes them feel happy, it makes us feel happy, and may I say, it perpetrates a myth that agriculture has not become industrialized. We have to accept that. Because I think once we do that, you know, we have a whole armamentarium and experience, as Paul knows from the course we've taught, in which we've developed policies that have been pretty effective at regulating the chemical industry, ensuring, when enforced, occupational safety in a variety of industries, dealing with zoning issues, environmental impact statements, and contract law. But as long as we persist, as long as we're in a kind of, a conspiracy with the industry to think we can go back to a pre-industrial model, we're not going to do the heavy labor of making this model better. And that's what I think, what I finally came up with at the end of this book. Well, I had a lot of challenges along my way. It wasn't exactly popular. In the local setting, a member of the Purdue family called Al Summer to warn him about the dangerous research that was going on at the school. And then later, when that didn't work, the Delmarva poultry industry called Bill Brody to warn him very directly about me. And that was a great moment, I have to say, and one of the fortuitous contingencies of doing this work at Hopkins, because Bill Brody called me, and I well remember when Rhonda Brown said, "The president's on the phone." I said, "What?" She said, no, our president," which was even more frightening for those of you who know Bill Brody. And he gets on the phone and he says, "Is this Dr. Silbergeld?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Delmarva poultry industry is not very happy with you." I said, "I can explain." He said, "Keep up the good work." So take that for a private university. We've also had our encounters with the national industry, and Carol remembers this well. We were with Keeve Nachman, one of the first to identify the use of arsenic in the growing of poultry. And so the National Poultry Council responded to our first paper with a wonderful article entitled "Arsenic is Natural." And I called them up and I said, "I'm so glad you noted that. You know, all my favorite things, natural, lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic. Yes, bring on the periodic table." And then international as well. I mean, there are challenges at all levels, from developed countries, developing countries, lower middle income countries. I'm now consulting with the World Health Organization on this problem, and somebody began our meeting by talking about the problems in lower and middle income countries. And since I was a new person there, I got up and I said, well, I really want to assert the primacy of where this problem really exists. It's in the United States, Brazil, and China, because we use the preponderance of antibiotics in food animal production, and we have the most complete adoption of this model with no restraints. So let's not pick on the lesser developed countries here. Let's deal with where the problem really is. And internationally, I've just come from working with WHO, and I realized that their policies right now really aren't preventive. They aren't looking to prevention. They have a categorization of drugs that you shouldn't use in agriculture. These are drugs where resistance is already out of hand. You know, do you need to be told about methicillin? No. Do you need to be told about polymyxins? I think so. So they're really responding to overwhelming evidence when it's really probably too late to do much about it. So there are still problems at all levels of recognizing what this problem is. And it's also, you know, as all of you know, I know Mike knows this, that public health is not universally admired. I know within this building, we all admire ourselves and each other. But I always think of Ibsen's play, which if you haven't seen it, this is the play for public health people. This is the doctor who tried to shut down the water supply for a town, and they didn't want to hear about it. And that's what we're all about, right? So this goes, you know, when the chicken industry was after me, I thought, this is nothing. I had to deal with the lead industry. Now, those are thugs. So in 1983, they said I was an ardent anti-lead activist. And it was great because Bill Ruckelshaus, who was back at the EPA at that time, wrote me a note saying, so am I. Johns Hopkins published an article about me, which I'm not sure the title was really, you know, there to win friends and influence people. I was called Lead's nemesis. But then somewhat later, the George W. Bush administration sent letters to Tom Burke and me dismissing us from the Scientific Advisory Council of the CDC, saying, we have no need of your services. The Poultry Council, of course, before they responded saying that arsenic was natural, they unfortunately said they didn't know why we were so concerned about what went on with chickens, because they said it's not as if we feed them arsenic. And remember, Carol, we thought that was such a strange thing to say. I think I said to Lance, would you look that up? And they did feed them arsenic. And so then later, some big agri-marketing magazine called me an ardent, critic of industrial food animal production. And the pork board, I think, much more openly said, you know, changing practice in the name of public health would be counterproductive. So that's what we're all up against, and it's all right there. As I said, now I'm on to what we could call bigger arenas, the World Health Organization Food Safety Program. And you may know that through the work of people like Anthony So and others, this really became front and center as an issue in the last UN General Assembly in terms of directing attention to what Sally O'Brien of the British chief medical officer said was the imminent end of antibiotics as effective treatments for all kinds of disease, modern medicine in a way, taking us back to the days that we're celebrating now with William Welch and the early history of public health. And going along with that, the World Bank said, you know, these drug resistance could cause a global economic burden equal to the 2008 financial crisis. And again, the UK government estimated that by 2050, global deaths due to drug-resistant infections will exceed all other causes of mortality. But the best thing that was really encouraging to me was that for the first time, they called out agriculture, which I have to say our CDC, our FDA, and certainly our USDA have yet to do. And so you'll get a lot of public announcements about how mothers should not demand antibiotics, doctors should not overprescribe antibiotics. But as Mike said, you know, over 85% of antibiotic production in this country still goes into agriculture, into feeds. And despite what anybody tells you, over the last 2 years, the amounts went up. So if anybody tells you they're not using these anymore, there's a little disconnect. And this was really very heartening to see this taken up as part of a global agenda on this enormous problem. So that's how it all happened, and it's really been, as I said, amazing that I'm up here standing and that there is something called Chickenizing Farms and Food that can be purchased, that I actually did write this book. So thank you very much.
People who have questions or comments to use the mics so that it's recorded on the podcast that we're going to put out. Great, you know, every time I hear you speak, I learn so much. Could you take us back to the? I missed. You know, I just got off the plane, so I'm in another time zone. But I missed the connection between the intrinsic factor in animals and pernicious anemia, to how that led to antibiotic use. Because you know, in humans, pernicious anemia is caused in some people by an infection by H. pylori. And so, you know, how did they go from the pernicious anemia intrinsic factor to antibiotic use?
Well, as Lucy Wills, who's kind of completely dropped out of this picture and is only remembered somewhat dimly as one of the first experimental nutritionists, because she actually wound up getting a degree in experimental biology as well as medicine. And she was confronted with this problem of pernicious anemia among the workers in India, and she discerned right away that there was an epidemiologic basis, and that was that it was much more prominent in Hindu women who were working in the mills than in Muslim women. And the difference was whether they ate meat. So she thought there's something in meat that seems to be able to correct this factor and perhaps contribute to growth as well. And that's what started her on her way. And she began to look at extracts from meat, from liver. And she did not completely identify the factor, but that's what really got her going. And then at Letterly, they took it up and started to see whether products of bacterial fermentation could do the same thing. And somehow it got settled on the drugs rather than bacterial fermentation products, which I think was a mistake. Mm-hmm.
So just, so I understand this question, just remind me that after this, we have a book signing and reception out in the gallery.
Great.
Okay?
Thank you. I want to take you way back to something you said at the very beginning, which is outside your area a little bit, but you said we want to give people what they want to eat. And
we don't want to. I think it's difficult to feed the world and also insist that the world adopt a diet that we think they should have.
That's not my question, though.
Okay.
My question is, food choices have changed over time.
That's
we know here we're eating less red meat than we used to, and in China they're eating more meat in general, and that as we get crisis level, maybe more people, we've got more vegetarians in this country now as a percent anyway.
By the way, the drop in red meat consumption has been more than made up by the increase in poultry production.
That's what I'm thinking, but how does this, I mean, we do influence. Public health is, physicians are finally catching on that maybe weight is a problem and what you eat makes a difference. So how do you factor that into what you've talked about? We're going more toward chickens and away from beef, and I mean, there is some way that public health and the industry and the advertisements and Mayor Bloomberg and everybody else can affect what people eat and drink. So
I actually looked into the evidence for that, and it's not very strong. And the dominating modality over changes that are relatively small in the United States and in the EU, they're relatively small. The Purdue company is not reducing production, and neither is Smithfield.
but
Reports.
beef
They're not really that much. You should look at the data.
per capita, I think it has gone down.
Well, you should look at the data. It was kind of disheartening. And this is absolutely overcome by the confluence of urbanization and increased incomes and increased exposure to other diets that's going on in the developing world. And I guess my sense is if people find effective ways to alter that trajectory, that's great. But in the meantime, people have to eat.
Amen, but
Amen.
just thinking about changes, how to change, if you,
Nobody has
Possibly
actually, nobody has actually really succeeded. There are a couple of very, very interesting books on the topic of trying to get people to change major diets, major diet change. And I have to tell you, meat and poultry production in this country have not changed. So Meatless Monday is a great idea, but it's really not having an impact on the big story. When I talk about food systems, I'm talking about big food systems, okay?
billions.
Not micro food systems.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. It's a tour de force. I want to ask a question that I asked another speaker at another seminar, and that is what proportion of human resistant infections are attributable to the use of antibiotics in animal feed?
Right.
And he couldn't give me an answer.
Well, I've thought a lot about that, and I'll ask for backup with Megan or her comment on this. But I've actually come to the decision that this is actually an impossible question to answer at this point. And it's because of the fact that, well, first off, most of our data on the emergence of antibiotic resistance is highly biased because it's usually first reported in a hospital setting because that's where you have the labs that can report it. But does that mean is that where it emerged? We don't know that. But at this point, we have, for example, several strains of Staph aureus, several strains of E. coli, some strains of Klebsiella, probably some others that you know about, Megan, which have been ascribed to be associated with animal hosts. But very soon, those strains get into the healthcare system. And of course, people in healthcare eat food. And one of the major vectors, I think now, and certainly urbanized, industrialized societies, is through food rather than direct contact with animals, though the direct contact with animals can be very intensive. So we talked a bit about this at the WHO meeting I was at last week, and I made the point that I'm not sure we can even answer that question anymore. Now, a very interesting thing went on at that meeting, in that there were several systematic reviews, one that was very well done, to look at the evidence for interventions of either starting to use antibiotics or taking them away. And the evidence, I'm happy to say, actually showed a statistically significant association between use in animals and appearance of antimicrobial resistant pathogens in the food supply, and in a few cases where people had studied human populations, namely in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia. So I don't think we can, I really wanted to figure out a way to answer it. And Megan in her dissertation tried to do that in a really innovative study, kind of case control study at a large teaching hospital in Pennsylvania. But I don't think we can do this. What do you think?
No, I would agree. I think that the problem is too that your genes, when you try to couple them with your pathogens, you can only track one aspect of their evolution, but the genes themselves are different.
Right,
And tracking the genes is nearly impossible.
right.
Because they are conserved.
Yeah. I mean, Lance Price, whom you may have asked this question to, he did a paper recently which showed that the so-called livestock-associated MRSA has a cycle of coming from humans, being adapted to animals, coming back into humans, and then going back again. So where does it start? This is something I'm very interested in trying to figure out, and really to get a much better clock on the emergence of antibiotic resistance rather than waiting to see which hospital reports, like, you know, the New Delhi E. coli strain, metalloproteinase strain, which is resistant to carbapenems. And that was, of course, reported in hospitals. But did it begin in hospitals? I mean, people are throwing carbapenems around in agriculture as a desperate way. So who knows? These are important questions, but I think now we can't answer them. We thought all this molecular biology would help us, but it just made it look, as Alice in Wonderland says, curiouser and curiouser.
So Paul, last question?
Thank you. I note that Dean Clagg began by saying that one of your areas of expertise is bringing science into policy, which I think you do extremely well. So my question really goes to the policy. You mentioned that we have a problem in this country because we haven't taken on big ag, and excuse me if I'm not citing you correctly, please.
No, that's true.
Where would you start with that on the policy front? We, you know, generally we've talked societally about having a food agency, breaking up USDA, and I don't know whether you agree or disagree with those ideas, but you probably have some other ones, and I wish you would share those with us.
Well, as John Bolin once said, when I enlisted him in an economic analysis, he said, "Oh, this will be fun. We're taking on big farm and big pharma." And we haven't made much of an impact at all. I do think, theoretically, we need a food agency, because one time when I was feeling really low down about the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I went and read its enabling statute. This is really important. You taught me this. You know how the EPA's enabling statute says to protect human health and the environment. OSHA says to provide a safe workplace for all. And so there's sort of a statement about what our goal is. Do you know what the stated goal of the U.S. Department of Agriculture is? To promote U.S. agriculture. Nothing about nutrition, nothing about food. And I recall this being told the story that when the scientific interest turned to DDT in birds, several people went down from Stony Brook University to talk to the USDA, which was in charge of pesticides, and explained the data about eggshell thinning, et cetera. And the person they talked to said, "We don't do birds at the U.S. Department of Agriculture." So there is a need. Are we going to get it? But I guess what I decided was one of the things I could do was write this book and try and reignite some consciousness. I didn't talk about the other thing I really felt strongly about, homage to Upton Sinclair, which is that worker safety comes before food safety. And that was another wonderful fight I had with the press. I like telling stories about the press because they gave me so much grief, which I deserved. But the original title was going to be Chickenizing Farms and Food. They were very unhappy that I didn't talk about recipes and things like that, but I said, we're not going there. But they wanted it to say consumers, animals, and workers. And I said, workers come first. And they said, no, that won't sell. I said, this is a game changer. I'm going to pull the book if you don't put workers first.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're a very forthright person. So,
People have said that.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, but thank you so much, and please join me in thanking all.
Thank you.